Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our conversation with Fiona Hill. I'm hoping this will be, I'm sure it will be, a really, really interesting discussion, just given everything that's going on in the Russia-Ukraine space. I think we've got Fiona with us. Fiona, are you there?
Yes, I think so. Can you hear?
Oh, yes, we can.
Perfect.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I'm just gonna dive in. I see we've got quite a few listeners, and I'm sure that a lot of them have sort of been following very closely, or at least even if they aren't, like it's very difficult to ignore just the Russia Ukraine crisis, particularly since we're seeing in the last few weeks like a lot of new developments, particularly in the diplomacy space, kind of ratcheting up. And of course, just to introduce ourselves first, for those not aware, Fiona Hill, as many of you know, a Russia expert, and of course was the intelligence officer on Russia and Eurasian affairs for Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and was also at the NSC in the Trump administration, and obviously now at Brookings. I'm Yara Bayumi. I run the World section at the New York Times' Opinion section, and so I've, to be very candid, Fiona, I've been trying to get you to write for us for quite a while on Putin, and our schedules never really quite meshed. But sort of given where we were a few weeks ago, it seemed like the right moment to talk about this and to kind of try and explain a little bit more about. Particularly about Vladimir Putin's motivations and why we are where we are today. And so your piece, it was exactly 2 weeks ago that published on Putin has the U.S. right where he wants it, gave a lot of like really fascinating insight for people to understand sort of where we are today. And so just to start us off, in those 2 weeks, we've now seen, I would say, a lot more diplomacy ratcheting up. We have the German Chancellor meeting with President Biden today. We have French President Macron is going to be meeting with Vladimir Putin today, I believe, as well. And at the same time, we've also seen, I think, an elevation on the part of the U.S. security community that's sort of been doing or using this very deliberate strategy, I think, of exposing very quickly a lot of Russia's misinformation and disinformation routines before they kind of, trying to kind of nip them in the bud, so to speak, which I think many of them seem to believe could be pretexts for a Ukrainian invasion. So just to start us off, like, where do you see things today? Are we any closer or not to thinking that Putin may be considering an invasion on Ukraine or not?
Well, thanks very much, Yara, and really glad that everyone could join today. I think where we are right now is still in that moment of waiting and seeing how Putin and the Russian troops are poised. I was part of a call that Brookings did a little earlier today with a whole host of various colleagues reviewing the situation. And those who are military experts have pointed out that the Russians are maybe about a week and a half to 2 weeks away for having all the forces arraigned where they would really want them for a major invasion. And of course, a lot of people are saying, well, okay, hang on, major invasion. Do you really mean that? This is one of the problems that I think, many military analysts and the intelligence community always face, is that when you warn of something because of what you see happening on the ground, which is in this case, all of the intelligence analysts and, again, military experts who, have either had access to some of the material that the US government has or even, complete and utterly unclassified open sources. You have a lot of satellite imagery that's out there from regular commercial satellites. You have investigative journalists who often access this, like the Bellingcat Group, for example. Mm-hmm. Everyone can see that the force posture is pretty much there for a major land invasion. If you're closer to it, sitting in Ukraine, obviously you wouldn't see it because this is really literally the bird's eye view. And the problem that you always have is one of warning. You mentioned in the introduction that I'd been the intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia back in the Bush and Obama administration. So I did the transition from one to the other. And I was the national intelligence officer for the period when Russia invaded Georgia. And we had been warning for a long time that Russia was poised to do something in Georgia. We were very worried that the Georgians would get lured in, baited into some kind of pretext operation, which is exactly what happened. We weren't exactly sure, where and what the actual date of that would be. And we had an awful lot of warning. And the problem was, I think in many respects, people became desensitized to it because we had months before of August 2008 in which we talked about, what we were seeing on the ground, various posturing by the Russians, lots of threats that were being given to the Georgians. And of course, there was an increasing standoff between the Georgians and the Russians, not just around the issue of Georgia, like Ukraine seeking to have a membership action plan for NATO in the April of 2008. But before that, because the Georgians had shown a lot of interest in reclaiming, understandably, the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia that had seceded from Georgia right at the very beginning of Georgian independence, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that Russia was building up its presence there. And so the problem came, of course, when the actual invasion came, that people said, well, why didn't you tell us? Because we couldn't say the exact date, the exact method down the rocky tunnel, from the North Caucasus into South Ossetia, for example. But we also saw massive exercises, regular exercises on the border that the Russians did in the Caucasus military district. And this is the same thing that's happening now. The Russians are moving all of these soldiers and all of the equipment under the guise of exercises in Belarus. They're also talking about an exercise that they're going to do, more in the, southern part of Russia, near the Sea of Azov and elsewhere. So we can see every evidence that they mean business.
So that kind of gets us then, it's all really fascinating, but it gets us to the question that I think like many of us have been trying to grapple with, which is in particular Putin's motivation here. And we've heard quite a few different arguments for whether he will or won't, based on sort of what is his bigger and ultimate goal here. I was interested to kind of mention a few sort of maybe dissenting arguments, so to speak, from the sort of he's likely to invade. Which, I see particularly, like we hear from the European side more often. So, for instance, we ran a piece by Ivan Krastev last week, and his point was that the Europeans specifically think that, in general, Putin's ultimate goal is something worse than war, which is this moment that we're actually in right now, this kind of keeping the West on edge, not really sure what he's doing, because that kind of serves his motive, and like it actually benefits him to kind of keep this situation sort of as unpredictable and as tense for as long as possible, because that kind of creates more room for him to carry out a lot of the other more immediate sort of goals that he may have in mind in the region, and particularly sort of with the ultimate aim of basically dividing Europe. And we also hear from Russians who say that like this was sort of a bluff that Putin tried to kind of carry out at the beginning, but he's now sort of caught in a trap of his own making. That was an argument from Yulia Latinina, who we had also like pretty recently.
Right.
How do you read those? Do you from where you're sitting, do these seem feasible? Do these seem like likely that that's kind of where we might be?
Sure. Look, there can be all of the above. The thing with Putin and Russia and the way that Putin acts is these don't have to be mutually exclusive. And let me sort of explain why. First of all, if you're launching one of these kinds of operations, you want to get everybody divided ahead of time, right? Because you want to get the sort of defeatist sentiment that's already embedded. You want to see how, when you're going against NATO, Europe, the US, and various allies, you want to divide those allies as much as possible. You want to keep the pain level up. You want to keep the threat level up, the pressure. Putin's explicitly said that. He said that in recent meetings with ambassadors. He's talked very openly about the fact that he wants the US to pay attention. He wants our undivided attention. He wants to make sure that we're listening and that we hear them now about all of the range of demands about Ukraine, NATO, and the US and US forces in Europe. In many respects, there's 30 years of demands all built up there since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and certainly 22 years worth of demands on the part of Vladimir Putin. This is like a very hefty bill that he wants to make due. And so, he's sort of sending the boys around to make sure that we all know what he wants. But the other issue here is, again, I'm referring back to, various colleagues who look at this very closely, is that they've done things that they've not done before in these instances. I mean, they've moved troops and equipment all the way over from the Russian Far East military district all the way to the borders of Ukraine. That's a very long way, thousands and thousands of kilometers. They've got kind of force posture that we don't usually see in exercises. And the forces right now are not arrayed as if to consolidate the already, existing state of affairs in Donbass, where, of course, proxy forces are there. And, those aren't actually included, the proxy forces in Donbass region, in the US calculations. They're arraigned now for a major offensive into Ukraine itself, not just from Belarus. And what you're saying earlier in the way you framed the question is also important, to keep in mind what else they could be doing, because Belarus now looks completely in Russia's pocket. Right. Which it wasn't, let's just say, a few months ago. So now, he's already moved on Belarus, and it's highly likely that all the force emplacements there will remain, which will put pressure not just on Ukraine in a more permanent fashion, but also on Poland and, Lithuania, which also border on Latvia, of course, as well, onto Belarus. Because Belarus is the main supply route for the exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea that's sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland. So there's that. So already there's an awful lot of pressure built up, just the sheer size of the force that's arraigned. And the fact that we can see that there are multiple options there. But again, Putin's probing. I mean, I think there is a bit of a pause now to kind of see how everyone reacts, see how united or not we're going to be. And of course, watching very closely who's saying what. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure someone in the Kremlin is sitting parsing all of those different op-eds that everybody's been writing to, kind of try to judge where sentiment is. And they'll also rely very heavily on the fact that people will be surprised and shocked by this, because in 2014, people weren't expecting them to move into Crimea. The Ukrainians weren't either. 2015, when they stepped up the offensive in Ukraine, it was the same thing. 2008 in Georgia, people didn't think that they would be able to do it. And what the administration is trying to do right now is try to call them out. Now, whether that will deter is another matter, but it's certainly, making it very clear that there's no ambiguity in what we think we're seeing there. But in terms of, kind of the big bluff, it's a bluff until it isn't, right? And that's the kind of agony that we're going to have to go through. And then, further afield, Putin can raise the ante somewhere else. Belarus is apparently now discussing having some changes to its constitutions for the potential stationing of nuclear weapons. And that's significant because both Belarus and Ukraine ended up being actually nuclear powers after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 30 years ago. We talk about this, Budapest Memorandum of 1994 that was supposed to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, when Ukraine, along with Belarus, both gave up, the arsenals that they had inherited from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And both of them agreed to be, Ukraine and Belarus, non-nuclear powers, including the stationing of nuclear missiles on their territory. So Belarus making that change will be significant. So that adds, to the question you're saying there. He can do things in Ukraine, but then up the ante elsewhere.
Okay, that is a lot. There's so much I want to follow up on there. But just before I do, want to take this opportunity to welcome our new listeners who have just joined in, and just to reintroduce ourselves. I am Yara Bayumi. I'm the editor of the World section at the New York Times' opinion section, and I'm speaking with Fiona Hill, who's now a senior fellow at the Center on the U.S. and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and obviously recently served in senior posts both at the NSC and as a senior intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council over the last as far back as like 2008 or so.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. And just to kind of kick off from where you left this, Fiona, I mean, is there a way then, given sort of how you've like very you very clearly outlined sort of all the differences in the sort of force posture that we haven't seen before. So we hadn't seen that in 2014. Can you see a way in which diplomacy actually will work? Is Putin interested then at this point in any diplomacy, or is the engagement that we're seeing, particularly from Sergei Lavrov and sort of the exchange of the letters and the responses on the Russian response or the Russian asks and the US's responses to those? I mean, there is a lot of quote unquote talk diplomacy that we're seeing, but given just everything from how the Russians deal with this, could it be in good faith?
Well, look, there's three different layers of diplomacy here, and I'll try to take each of them on, not for too long, obviously, because I don't want to talk too long here, and make sure that we get some of the other questions. So first of all, there's Ukraine. Second, there's NATO, and third, there's the United States. And I laid that out a bit in the op-ed that we did together back a couple of weeks ago. On Ukraine, I think the diplomacy is going to be honestly very difficult. We have the Minsk group, the Minsk process, and the Normandy format. So the Minsk group is this whole idea of trying to, or the Minsk process, find some kind of resolution for the ongoing conflict in Donbass. And the agreements that were, basically signed onto under duress by Ukraine, way back when, after all of this started off, there was 2 rounds of this, really would consolidate the Donbass region as a kind of a permanent problem inside of Ukraine, basically giving Donbass leverage over Ukraine's national foreign policy and security directions, as well as being, a major drain on the economy as they have to try to reconstruct it, for example. The Normandy format is the French and the Germans, meeting with the Russians, to try to resolve this along with the Ukraine, and that's kind of got revved back up again. And some people are hoping that if Ukraine can be, pushed towards implementing the various stipulations of Minsk II, that will be satisfactory for Russia. I don't think so, because what Russia really wants to make sure, and we talk a lot about Ukraine being independent and democratic, and
right,
kind of Russia's opposed to Ukraine's democracy, and you've had quite a few op-eds in the New York Times about that.
Yeah,
it's not as simple as that. I mean, what Russia doesn't really believe that Ukraine will ever become a democracy. They don't really believe that democracy exists. I mean, look at what Russia and China have recently said. It's just up to countries to say when they're a democracy or not, and they've declared themselves, democracies. Putin thinks that a democracy is, kind of something unattainable, that no country is a real democracy, including the US and Europeans. It's just who shouts the loudest and who pays the most in politics. And he has a kind of point, doesn't he, given some of the debates we're having, here at home about everything. But what he doesn't want to see is Ukraine going anywhere that isn't in Russia's orbit. He wants to see a change of government. Zelensky out somebody who he approves coming in. He wants to have a permanent veto and decision-making authority over anything that Ukraine does. So it's yes. I mean, he doesn't want Ukraine to be basically independent and basically moving in a different direction, autonomous, have its own sovereignty. He wants to have Ukraine, in an old style, almost medieval or early modern European dependency on Russia. It doesn't necessarily want to reincorporate it. Belarus, might be another matter at this rate. But, with Ukraine not going anywhere, not making any decision that doesn't factor in everything that Moscow thinks, and certainly having his own group of people in Ukraine. So there's a problem. And I don't think we're going to be able to resolve that one. On the second thing, on NATO, and then the third thing on the United States, there are things that we could do. In terms of diplomacy, talking about the European security structures, we have a lot of questions about how we could actually address this issue of exercises. I mean, Russia is kind of trolling us at the moment. We've had the breakdown of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. It broke down really in 2007, 2015. Russia just said they weren't going to do this anymore. That used to actually involve a lot of verification and observance of each other's exercises, for example, and where troops were based, conventional forces. We could go back to the drawing board and start talking about that. We had all kinds of, agreements on nuclear missile placements in Europe. And the United States has been willing to discuss all of this with Russia. We've just been very slow at the pickup, over several administrations.
Right.
And what comes next after INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, what to do about tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, which the Russians have. The Russians are the ones who actually have missiles in Europe, nuclear missiles, not the United States. In the places that we're really concerned about, they have Iskanders in Kaliningrad that I mentioned before, and that's maybe what they're talking about putting in Belarus. So Russia was violating the INF Treaty for so long, which is why the United States pulled out in August of 2019. And then this administration has extended the New START Treaty that was concluded in 2010 for another period, and we could be negotiating all of this. So there's also other confidence building measures, the Open Skies Treaty that's also, kind of fallen apart. We could go back to that. There's all kinds of different things that we could negotiate if Russia really wants to on NATO and on the United States bilateral level. But of course, the other thing that Russia wants is a complete agreement that neither Ukraine nor Georgia nor any other former Soviet state will ever be a member of NATO. And that's another one of those sticking points that becomes problematic. We probably could finesse that, but not under duress, not under these kinds of circumstances.
And do you feel, just given, again, like the thorny issues that you've just explained there, that there is something that would be in the vein of an acceptable, like we hear this a lot, but it's hard for me to kind of really connect the dots with it, of like, we need to find, there needs to be an off-ramp for Putin. Like if there's something that we can offer that will make him save face, like it's all framed in that guise. And I wonder just how do you, is that sort of the posture that the US and the West should be taking in how they're approaching and dealing with Putin? Like, let's find a way for him to save face with this? Is it the same playbook that they're both playing from then?
Well, look, he's looking for us to take an off-ramp, basically to back off, if we want to, take that a little bit further. I mean, he's made it very clear those demands that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put forward on behalf of Russia to NATO and the United States are the maximal things that they would like to have. They know a lot of those things are non-starters, but they're trying to push us to do exactly what we're doing, which is see what we come up with. They've set the ceiling, which is pretty high, and they haven't given us a floor. And so they want to see, what we come forward with this. So we're in a really very awkward dynamic. They've also portrayed us, very carefully and very cleverly as the aggressors. There was not any specific action that was taken by Ukraine or the United States that triggered all of this off. It was an accumulation of factors. I'm not trying to say that there wasn't anything. There were lots of things. There was a big accumulation. But this is really of Putin's choosing and timing. Because, for him, he's been president for 22 years now. And over that time, he's built up a head of steam of frustration and anger and grievance by all the different things that have happened. And he doesn't want to lose Ukraine on his watch. Because in the time that he has been president, Ukraine has gone, kind of closer and closer toward NATO. Now, that's in large part because of actions that the Russians have taken that have been aggressive towards Ukraine. But I mean, remember now, he's been at it a long time, cutting off gas to Ukraine in 2006. 2004 was one of the big bang entry points for, the Eastern Europe and the Baltic states into both the EU and to NATO. Ukraine, there was already some, kind of machinations around, possible NATO, but, wasn't really quite on the cards there. 2008, when Ukraine makes the application with Georgia for membership action plan, we just keep going on. So since 2006 and the spat over energy and, Ukraine's politics at that time, we've been in this, really confrontational relationship with Russia. We just haven't been paying as much attention as the Russians have, because we've gone through several administrations, different viewpoints. We were kind of hoping this had all gone away. Of course, Crimea and what happened in Donbass were a massive shock, but it's been 7+ years. So, we've got complacent, and we haven't realized that for Russia, they've been focused on this all the time. And every sign, every new development in Ukraine is put through this, very negative lens. So no, I don't think Putin is looking for an off-ramp. He's looking for what it is that we are going to offer him. And of course, we have to be creative in thinking about, what we're going to do on the diplomatic front. European, security, there's lots of flaws there that, we need to address. We've been, addressing things piecemeal for a long time. So again, it's reasonable to sort of think that we would start to have discussions about upgrading and refurbishing, some of our treaties, our agreements, our confidence building measures. But I'm not sure that that's where, unfortunately, Putin is right now. Right. And again, I mean, the more that he menaces, the more that, he watches as we're running around, knocking each other over, trying to kind of figure out what to do, the more that he's going to ratchet the pressure and see what he can squeeze out of us. So I don't think he's looking for an off-ramp right now.
So, I mean, if he's not looking for an off-ramp, and again, given all of the moves that you've said that we're seeing at the border, what should the West's posture be right now? I mean, should it be in this sort of reactive mode to kind of see okay, well, let's kind of figure out what we, the West, can offer Putin, or should there be sort of a different way to be confronting Putin on this? Is there another way?
Well, I mean, rather than sort of saying we're trying to, figure out, how to accommodate Putin, we should be thinking about what do we want ourselves. I mean, clearly, there is no interest in having a perpetual confrontation with Moscow, right? I mean, we've been in these ups and downs in this relationship for years now. 2007, the infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference, since then it's been, pretty dire. I mean, you've had these brief interludes, and then it's just been like a roller coaster of, one thing after another. And even prior to that, I mean, we've got to bear in mind, the Russian worldview on this, the idea of some strategic empathy, where they're coming from. Initially, with NATO, of course, that whole debate backwards and forwards about NATO expansion. Yeah. But they were, I would just say, reasonably sanguine about it until 1999, when there was the NATO operation against Milosevic and the bombing of Belgrade in 1999. It was a NATO operation, not just a US operation. That really underscored to all Russians, that NATO was still a military alliance and could be used against them. Even though, it was, we said it was a very specific case, they thought, well, no. I mean, because, of course, Belgrade is in, what they would think of their sphere of interest. Right. And then you have 2003, when the United States goes into Iraq, not just Afghanistan, which the Russians kind of got. I mean, they've been there, done that. But Iraq, they thought that, for their point of view, that the United States was just underscoring that it was in the business of massive regime change. And add that to what had happened in Serbia in 1999, and they'd start to think, okay, great, the United States is going to, and it was also NATO, right? I mean, it was also a NATO operation, like within Afghanistan. And, after the whole 9/11 and the invoking of Article 5. So Russia starts to see NATO in a very different light from perhaps what they did in the 90s. And then you have, of course, the expansion of NATO in 2004. So, from Putin's point of view, this has been a long time in coming. And, we also are going to have to, do some thinking ourselves about the long-term relationship. It's clearly not going to be sufficient as it is. We clearly can't just go from one confrontation to the next. So we have to kind of figure out how we stabilize that in some fashion. So again, we should think about what we want. What do we want this relationship to look like? I mean, clearly we don't want to sell Ukraine and its independent sovereignty down the river, because that will open up a whole Pandora's box globally, not just in Europe. And, kind of basically, for the United States as well, we're both trying to think about our broader international posture right now. So I think, we need to think about those things. We don't have to just be driven by Putin, but obviously we do have to think about the longer term nature of this relationship. And then there's, the Russia-China angle to factor in against, the backdrop of, some quite astounding, things. I mean, not astounding in general terms, but astounding they've actually said it, because that's kind of, again, unprecedented, that, having China come out and also complain against NATO enlargement, which on the surface wouldn't be, so much of an issue for China. But that's already making a move in different directions that we're seeing. Russia and China latching themselves ever closer together as well, which obviously is particularly troubling from the United States global position.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was actually something I wanted to mention. I did think that, I mean, it was really interesting to see the meeting in Beijing at the Olympics between Presidents Putin and Xi, and hearing Xi kind of, it wasn't just I mean, for them to be on the same side and to kind of talk about them being allies is something we've obviously all seen before. But I was particularly struck by how vociferous and explicit we were hearing from China about, the sort of standing right beside Russia and being against what they see as like this NATO expansionism, and sort of framing the tensions that we are seeing right now as largely the fault of the US and the West. And I know that there seems to be a lot of talk, and that I'm sure you've seen it as well, how the way in which the US deals with Putin and Russia is, China's watching closely, because that will dictate how it might then kind of think about if it is any particular actions on Taiwan. I don't, I have seen that, but I don't know that I've actually seen or read anything that kind of like really tries again to connect the dots for me that this is really something in China's in China's calculus, and like how it's looking at what's unfolding between Russia and the US. But certainly, like, first I'm interested to hear what you think about that, but also where, from the US side, how should it be thinking about China in this moment, and particularly after the weekend and sort of the like very overt display of a close alliance between Russia and China?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's extremely interesting, and I think it's something that we're all going to have to be following very closely, because it's also appears to be a work in progress, and it's not without its tensions and other notable points that also, indicate that they're not completely latched together. First of all, I mean, the Chinese didn't say anything against Ukraine. I mean, it's probably an easy shot about NATO. I mean, why would China particularly like NATO? Obviously, it's not a major threat to China, but why would they be interested in the expansion of a military alliance that's led by the United States? They wouldn't, right? But in terms of Ukraine, China's got its own relationship with Ukraine. President Xi called President Zelensky on the anniversary of Ukraine's independence. Russia, obviously would have hoped to maybe get Chinese recognition of the annexation of Crimea, but they haven't. And they also didn't get the recognition of the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And if they declared the independence of Donbass, they probably wouldn't get China's interest in that either. Because if you think about it, in part, that's the way that Taiwan created this sort of independent status for itself, a quasi-independent status. I mean, we all see Taiwan as de facto independent, but that was because, it was the place that the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, fled to during the Chinese Revolution, and stayed there and declared themselves an alternate government. And so, kind of China would probably not want to acknowledge the independence of other sort of separatist states, because that's how they see Taiwan, and they'd be also worried about Xinjiang and Tibet and you name it. So they're being really rather careful. And though Russia says that it's the historic territory of Crimea, Crimea has become not just under the sovereignty of Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the administrative transfer from Russia to Ukraine, but at various other points, Crimea has been under the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't always under Russia, and there's a lot of territory that the Russians are sitting on north of the Amur River, east of Lake Baikal, that used to be Chinese territory far more recently, in the the 1860s, for example. Then people would be thinking about before the 1860s, rather. That's when the Russians seized that. So Russia is always still viewed by China as one of the European colonial powers that predated on its territory. That being said, however, obviously the Chinese and Russians have a big vested interest right now in the strategic partnership that they've been developing. It's in opposition to the United States. And from China's point of view, I mean, this is super useful in terms of fleshing out what the United States' allies are likely to do in the event of, some kind of major territorial dispute. It's and China's got lots of them, of course, with Japan, with most of its neighbours, with India in the Himalayas, where they got into a shooting exchange not so long ago, and many others besides that as well. And of course, Russia's longest border is with China, as well as then with Mongolia and Kazakhstan. It's certainly not with NATO, but this really gets the United States completely distracted in China's view. Not completely. I mean, we're obviously still able to do, a few other things as well. I mean, the recent, taking out of the ISIS, commander, for example. But we're not devoting the same level of attention as we certainly intended to dealing with China. And, really, Russia's got us all on notice. And I think China is watching this very carefully to see how we react and how we deal with it. And it's extraordinarily useful for China. We could get bogged down. It's not just the question of the Russians getting bogged down, but we could get bogged down in dealing with this as well. While China then may feel it has more of a free hand globally, not just in its own region. I think that's, speaks to what you just spoke about, about the message that it's sending through this Olympics. We don't need anyone else. We can put on this spectacular show, ourselves, and China feeling very confident, that we're all.
Yeah, absolutely. If I bring it back, I mean, I've been very curious to kind of talk about the Russia-China relationship, but I want to sort of just bring it back to the moment at hand now.
Ukraine and everybody else. I mean, God knows where this is going.
Right. Got it. I think we may. Sorry, I think you cut out a tiny bit.
Yes,
but I think
I was getting a phone call coming in. I tried to get rid of it, and so I think that might have cut me out. I don't know where I cut out at. Sorry.
No worries. I was just saying. I think you just finished off your thought on China and it feeling very confident right now as well. And I was just saying that I'd like to just bring it back a little bit to sort of the moment at hand. The moment at hand, and we talk about Ukraine, and I'm struck by how little Ukraine itself actually figures in the debate and in the conversation. And so I wanted to ask you specifically, how do you see President Zelensky, managing this crisis right now? Like, I was really sort of struck at the end of last year, where really the alarm bells were what I saw were mostly coming from Ukraine and sort of telling the West, like, this is going on, don't ignore it, it's really dangerous. And then sort of seeing like a change a little bit in that posture, particularly sort of after the US kind of has been coming out very strong about Russia's motives and Russia's moves. And we've sort of been seeing Ukraine kind of saying, well, don't escalate this, like nothing is happening imminently, it's not as dangerous. Now, on the one hand, I presume that one reason to do that would be because, Zelensky does not want to kind of completely alarm his people. But on the other, I'm trying to kind of understand a little bit more, like, what's the motivation behind sort of the different signaling that we'd seen, over the past few months. Like, it doesn't seem like it was it's changed a little bit. It's not been consistent. What's your read on that?
Well, I think that's a really good observation, Yara. Yeah, I mean, obviously, initially, Ukraine was really worrying that it would, kind of disappear off the radar screen. I mean, they were getting an awful lot of, pressure on the ground. The shift really came when, I guess, the United States spotted basically the movement of forces, and that it didn't look like a, regular exercise. And that's, one thing where, despite intel sharing, it's obviously more difficult for Ukraine to, see from its vantage point. And then, of course, when you're on the ground anywhere, I'm sure everyone's got that same kind of experience. I mean, you can be right in the middle of a storm, but you don't know what everybody else is, kind of experiencing anywhere. You just know where you are and what's happening around you. You don't actually know what else is coming. It's like the classic, stories in the, from the past before such advances in meteorology, when people were in the eye of a hurricane and thought that, that it ended, and then it just came and blasted them again. I think, that's unfortunately where, Ukraine finds itself right now. And, Zelensky, I think from his perspective, of course, as you're saying here, everything is all being talked around Ukraine. That's exactly what the Russians want. They want to have, Zelensky and the Ukrainians look more like their puppets, because that's part of the whole propaganda battle, that they don't have agency, they don't have, decision-making power. The fact that we're at odds with each other on messaging, or at least seem to have been at odds on messaging, is perfect. Of course, from Zelensky's point of view, as you said, he doesn't want to have panic. They want to have preparation. They want to be calm and, kind of give an air of decisiveness, because, of course, the Russians are seeking to get rid of him and get someone else in. It's not great, of course, that Zelensky's in the middle of a big spat with the former president, Poroshenko, and others, around him. Not exactly the best time to be doing these kinds of things, for example. But on the other front, the Ukrainian government had been on the verge, and I think this is another reason, why Russia made a move now on getting its economic situation sorted out. Macroeconomic stabilization. It had a deal with the IMF. There was getting more investment in Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy was looking like it was picking up after a period since not just the global financial crisis of 2010, but obviously after the annexation of Crimea and the seizure of a lot of its military forces and its navy, and the conflict in Donbass, that they were starting to turn themselves around a bit. And what has happened recently, of course, is the threat of war has led to a flight from the economy, and Zelensky is trying to prop up the hryvnia. That's expensive, trying to do that. So there's not a big run on the currency. He wants to keep investors there. He's looking to the World Bank and others, for assistance. And, for the Russians, it'll be a win, no matter what, if they've crushed and tanked the Ukrainian economy. And, again, I don't think the timing was entirely coincidental in the pickup of this. There's also the fact that he's been going after a number of the oligarchs, including Viktor Medvedchuk, who everybody knows by now is very close to Putin, a close personal friend. You can also see there's a good article in Time magazine recently about Medvedchuk and his relationship with Putin. Putin's the godfather of his daughter, Medvedchuk's daughter. And when Zelensky started going after Medvedchuk, is also kind of around the same sort of time that, kind of the Russians started to build up. So there's personal issues, there's economic issues, there's all kinds of things going on. And that makes the situation in Ukraine very complicated and, difficult for Zelensky to deal with.
Got it. Okay, we're sort of on that note. I want to kind of move then the conversation a little bit to where Europe is in all of this, because that seems to be like a very big part of part of the reckoning that the U.S. is kind of trying to manage as well. That it's not just the U.S. relationship with Russia, but obviously how the U.S. sort of manages and thinks about sort of Europe's relationship with Russia as well. And, I was curious to hear from you whether you felt that Europe is really on the same page in how it deals with Russia. I was struck by, and obviously, like for Germany's had like a particular position here, where within Europe, at least, it's seen as sort of the outlier in how it's confronting Putin, particularly in this crisis. And we've seen, I think, an elevation of the French president sort of taking the diplomatic helms, at least, of this crisis, whereas in 2014 it was very much Angela Merkel sort of at the fore. But I wonder, I was struck actually by reading the background briefing this morning that the White House held ahead of the chancellor's visit here. It was very much pushing Europe is on the same page, like everyone in Europe is on the same page, and everyone in Europe is on the same page as the US and how to deal with this. And I wonder, just again, from your reading and from what you're seeing, does that seem to be the case, or do you think there are fractures within Europe that is weakening the response, or that at least Putin is kind of trying to poke at to see how far he can go?
Well, there are definitely fractures there that Putin can poke at, and certainly will, and we've seen many of them. one really big one, putting aside France and Germany and the meta level right now, is the investment that Russia has made in all kinds of strategic industries in Europe. That we've been very careful with our CFIUS process,
Right.
that we don't get Russian oligarchs with major exposure here, that we have some, to be clear. I mean, we have had Russian investment in the United States in the steel sector and energy sector, for example. But in Europe, you have quite a lot of investment in European companies. And then, of course, you have the flip of European investors. I mean, there's US investment as well, but all the sanctions, have curtailed a lot of US investment. But you've still got very heavy European investment in Russia. And Putin's assumption is that all of those investors will, in fact, become a lobby for Russia, that they will lobby against the imposition of really hard sanctions, especially in the energy sector, where, of course, we all know, there's been a very good coverage of this in the Times, that the Europeans haven't done a great job against the backdrop of the pandemic of getting sufficient gas storage, because the economy went into, a massive downturn, and they, weren't really figuring out when it would build back up again, and they haven't taken care of gas storage for the winter. The energy demand went down, now it's gone back up, and Russia can play with that. For example, we've just heard that on the German note, that former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder has been, asked to go onto the Gazprom board, for example. I mean, he was already, kind of in the mix there too, but, not right there as far up, as he appears to be now. And Putin's been calling in delegations of Italian businessmen. He basically, Putin thinks he can play this. Right. That there will be sufficient resistance in European business economic circles for him to basically undermine the sanctions. And also, then we get to Germany and Nord Stream 2, that this is going to be very costly for the German government to, basically pull back on. There'll probably be lawsuits. As one of my, colleagues said earlier, today, billions of euros in lawsuits against the German government and others, for a breach of contract, for example. So there's all kinds of ways in which Putin wants to make sure that sanctions are a double-edged sword, that they're, it's like mutually assured destruction from the nuclear phase of the Cold War. He's moved that into the economy, and this has been deliberate. I mean, the Russians for decades have been actually saying that, in the past they had the Red Army, now they have gas pipelines and Rosneft and Lukoil and, Gazprom, and, they've kind of basically penetrated the European economy. And, in London and, many capitals around the world, there's been things from campaign contributions to, basically buying off former, high-level officials. It's not just Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. He's just become the poster boy for that kind of thing. And they believe, they can call in all of those chits. And then, as you've mentioned, France as well. So the German government, I think they are on the same page. It's just they're going to have a lot of problems with their economic position and their investors. And, as we all know, the German system, the economic and political powers are very closely tied together. And then in the French case, President Macron really wants to take the lead in diplomacy. France has got the chairmanship of the European Union right now. There's the NATO position of France. And then, there's a past precedent of President Sarkozy in 2008, when I think France also might have had the EU presidency, of taking charge of the diplomacy after the Russians invaded Georgia. And, Macron has always launched these independent diplomatic initiatives. He's been doing that for a couple of years now. And I think, he tries to see himself in the role of mediator. It's not the first time. When I was in the administration at the NSC, France wanted to mediate between the United States and Iran, for example. So this is kind of very frequent, and also offered on Ukraine and Russia, not just within the Normandy format where France already has a role, along with Germany, but, in other kind of settings as well. So those are all things that Russia can play with. I mean, they don't have to be all of the other fractions that we can think of fracturing. I mean, there's Poland at odds with the EU, the Polish-Belarusian border crisis that we had a while back, Hungary. The Russians are also inviting other Europeans, really to take kind of pot shots. We just had Viktor Orban in Moscow signing a deal for cheap gas. And the
Right.
Hungarians have blocked loads of initiatives on Ukraine because they've made a bid for the Ukrainian ethnic Hungarian population in the Transcarpathian region around the sort of city of Uzhgorod in Ukraine, which is also, happens to be on the border with Slovakia. And the Hungarians have been pretty, revisionist in, their claims on, the various Hungarian minorities in Romania and Ukraine and elsewhere, and basically sort of saying that they're under persecution and genocide. They've said that has been perpetrated against them, and they have their own interests in what happens next. So that's complicated too. Mm-hmm. And then one other quick thing that maybe the Russians haven't necessarily thought about, but maybe they have. There are very large populations of Belarusian and Ukrainian emigres all over Europe now. I mean, an awful lot of Ukrainians have left. And there are about 1 million in Slovakia. It's the second largest ethnic group now across the border in Slovakia. They're all over Poland, elsewhere in Europe, in construction and all kinds of things and other, positions, and especially in Germany. So it could become very complicated for European countries, where you have diaspora politics playing as well.
Absolutely. So, given just everything that you've said right now and what we've talked about over the last 50 minutes or so, I have two very quick questions. One is sort of a very micro one, and then sort of I want to close with sort of a big picture question. But just so on the very micro level, what would you say is the next development that we should be sort of watching out for to get some sort of indication about whether we still are on the path of possible escalation, and whether diplomacy seems to actually be having some sort of effect, and sort of, I guess, taking the temperature down a little bit?
Well, on that level, I mean, we're not seeing any indication of that yet. I mean, we've seen some sort of maybe vaguely positive noises from some of the Russian diplomats about, not totally rejecting US responses to their various demands in these documents they submitted in December, completely out of hand. Yeah. But at the same time, okay, we can look at that and feel hopeful slightly. But then when you look at the force movements, you get the exact opposite impression. I mean, they're just continuing to build up. The other thing I would say is, watching what happens in Belarus. It's not just, the statements of Lukashenko, but I mean, do they go through with a constitutional change to allow themselves to host missiles? I mean, this might not really change Russia's overall posture, but it will certainly scare the heck out of Poland, which they're going to, and Lithuania, which they're right next to. And, other pressures like this. I mean, right now, we're not really seeing any evidence that the Russians are backing down in any way. I mean, I know some people think they've blinked a bit, but look, I mean, we don't really think from the military perspective that they're quite ready yet. So This is, more of a strategic pause. Everybody's kind of looking towards the end of the Olympics, but, it's kind of, as one of my colleagues was saying a little earlier, it's more about the facts on the ground with the military movements that we should be paying attention to here.
Right.
Because, there are always going to be, shifts in the overall language. And again, I mean, the Russians have made it very clear that they are putting all of the onus on the United States and NATO. They're saying the United States and NATO are the aggressors. That's what popular opinion in Russia thinks. And they've been feeding that, very successfully in Europe and elsewhere too. I mean, we have plenty of actors in our own politics who are saying the same thing. And, there's a lot to be said about, what's happened with, various developments in NATO and elsewhere. But the timing of all of this crisis is all about Russia and Putin's decision making.
Got it. Definitely be looking out for all of those. And it does feel very worrying when you kind of look at the force movements. And as you say, we could be hopeful about the vague moves and vaguely positive noises, but that's probably not where we want to put our hopes on. And in terms of like just the big picture, I guess one thing I want to pose is what the Russians have been saying in terms of the rhetoric that they've been using and how the U.S. has chosen to respond to that, is very much in the sphere of influence and the sphere and the rhetoric around spheres of influence. And I want to see where you fall on that debate, because the Biden administration has been very specifically kind of explicit in saying that countries don't have the right to sort of dictate the policies of another country, or to tell it, or to say with whom it wants to be in alliance with. In the Ukrainian example of whether or not it wants to join NATO, that should be up to Ukraine, and it should not be up to Russia. And of course, the Russian rhetoric that we see is like, well, the U.S. has always kind of done or exercised its sphere of influence in one form or another, for the last, for decades. And so, is where I just wonder, like, into when the rhetoric kind of is in that space of spheres of influence and realpolitik, like, is there a constructive way in which to have this conversation, or should there just be an acceptance of that reality?
Well, look, this is. The fact that we're even having this, it just shows how much we've all bought into the framing for the Russians. It's the whataboutism. What about the United States as a terrible actor? Well, what's that got to do with Ukraine? Ukraine isn't in the US sphere of influence. If that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
I when I was in the NSC, for example, there was a whole crisis in Venezuela. And, this was with Nicolas Maduro, staying on. He has stayed on, the other provisional, government that was elected there. And there was a whole international coalition, trying to push for the, the Maduro government to recognize that they'd lost the election. And of course, they weren't going to. And then, you may remember that the Russians sent in 100-odd special, technical forces there to forestall what they said was going to be a US invasion. And then behind the scenes, the Russians tried to swap Venezuela for Ukraine, basically saying, we're in your sphere of influence now, you get out of ours. And people were like, no, Venezuela isn't ours, and we don't want Venezuela, and we don't want Ukraine either. And, we didn't take a stance in the Ukrainian election in support of Poroshenko, for example, and the Russians couldn't figure that out, couldn't say why, because we were trying to make the point, we were trying to move away from all of this. Exactly. Yes, the United States has been a terrible actor in the past, but that doesn't sort of justify Russia predating upon Ukraine. I mean, yes, lots of people are writing op-eds everywhere about the United States needs to fess up to its sphere of influences in the past. And, we do need to address that ourselves. We shouldn't be, justifying our own pressures on, our neighbours either. The point is that Ukraine is an independent sovereign actor that's had its independence recognised for 30 years by the international community. And if Russia gets away with what it's doing in Ukraine, this is why they want to make it all about the United States, then China can take, the land in the Himalayas from India that it's spatting with. China could take the land from Russia at some point later. China can declare a massive sphere of influence wherever it wants. Everyone can, right? I mean, it depends on who's got the preponderance of power in their immediate neighbourhood. And yes, the United States has been a bad actor. We can play whataboutism, but Ukraine isn't about the United States. And also, the Russians signed on to the Helsinki Fine Act, the Paris Charter, and a whole host of other treaties that enshrined the right of countries, including themselves, to choose their own alliances and their foreign policy. And those were all affirmed by Russia when it became the successor state to the Soviet Union. So, basically, the Russians are rupturing their own sets of treaties and guarantees, and they guaranteed Ukraine in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum. They've completely ruptured that when Ukraine gave up the nuclear arsenal. They've said, well, the circumstances have changed. Well, what if later on down the line, Russia needs our help when China says the circumstances have changed? I'm not saying that's going to be now. That would be a fantasy. And then, the Chinese say, well, hey, we'd like that land just north of the Amur River. So we're basically opening up a huge kind of worms here. So other countries have to step up there as well. Because what's the difference between Ukraine and Poland? Just a matter of years, right, in terms of independence. Or Ukraine and Hungary. Or Ukraine and Romania. Or Ukraine and Slovakia. And all the other Eastern European countries. Or frankly, Germany, that wasn't unified until the 1870s. Or Italy. So we're all kind of, or what if Britain suddenly decided, it wanted to take back some of its former colonies? The United States had a spat with Britain and France in 1956 over the Suez Canal, because Britain and France thought they were still the old colonial overlords of, the Middle East. So, I mean, yes, the United States is not a perfect actor, it's an imperfect actor. But this whataboutism that we're playing in as well doesn't help us solve this problem. That's why, I advocated the New York Times piece, and actually, the administration did this, take it to the United Nations.
Yes.
I mean, there needs to be a different framing here. The more we frame it in as well, Ukraine deserves to get whacked because the United States has a sphere of influence. I mean, that's insanity, honestly. That's not going to get us anywhere. I mean, it's not insanity, obviously, it's pretty cunning, clever, kind of way of framing it from the point of view of Russia. But if you reform it in a different way, I mean, there is no country that is still existing in historic borders from time immemorial.
No, of course not. No, absolutely not. That was really insightful, Fiona, and it was really, you really kind of give us a lot to think about here with, particularly with that framing, because you're right. I mean, there is a lot of debate right now around this issue, and it does appear to play very much into the Russian rubric. So, it was interesting to see sort of the early movement at the United Nations. I'm not quite sure where that's going to land, really. It feels a little bit feeble now, but maybe we'll see a little bit more movement on that front if it's not too late. But I want to stop here and say thank you very much for your time and for this really engaging discussion with you. I learned a lot more than I knew 2 weeks ago, and I've been working on this issue for quite a while now. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone who listened in, and we look forward to more discussions soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yara. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.